to your ERP implementation, a view from reality. This event is held by Department of Information System, Faculty of Intelligent Electrical and Informatics Technology, Institut Teknologi Sepuluh Nopember. Before we start our guest lecture today, I would like to share our agenda. So here we go. May I share my screen?
Yep, all good.
Thank you. Okay, here we go. So first of all, we will have a welcoming speech by the representative of Information System Department. And just right after the welcoming speech, we will go to the main session, which is lecture and Q&A. And this guest lecture will be ended by 4 o'clock. So now let's move to the first agenda, which is welcoming speech by the head of Information System Study Program. That will be represented by Mr. Muklason. Hello, Pak Muklason.
Okay. Hello.
Okay, time is yours.
Okay, can you hear me, Ika?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Okay then. Okay, all right. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, Caspar. Okay, so my name is Ahmad. I'm talking here representing our head of department that unfortunately cannot join now. All right. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for Caspar. It is a great pleasure for us to have you today to give a talk. Hopefully, we can have you in person next year, maybe. You should come to Indonesia, as Mahendra said. You must come to Bali and enjoy. Everything is natural here in Indonesia. All right. And then I would like to thank to Bu Mahendrawati. We are very proud. We have a very, very outstanding person like Bu Mahendra. I know she has very, very great circle, very, very outstanding people, especially in business process management. And it's a great for us to have that kind of people to give a kind of international environment, international atmosphere to our department. So thank you very much, Bu Mahendra. And then I also would like to thanks to the organizer for this event. Without your help, this talk will never happen. Caspar, for your information, in our department, we have 3 study programs. We have undergraduate program, and then we have master and also doctoral program. The doctoral program is just start this year, so hopefully we can have a collaboration again. Bu Mahendra will have some Ph.D. student. Maybe Bu Mahendra will have some research collaboration with you again. And then finally, I would like to thanks to all participants. Today's talk, I think is very, very important. BPM, I think, is on the hot issue currently because everyone now is not only focusing on the technology, but the most important thing is on the business process. Right? So I do believe this talk, today's talk, will give new insight, new knowledge, and I know that you are not only from academia, but you are from industry. So it's very, very important for us as academia to have new insight as your experience in the real world. Okay, I think this is what I can say today. So have a great talk and enjoy the talk, everyone. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for your speech, Bapak Mukhlasan. Okay, now we are going to the main session. Let's learn BPM approach in ERP implementation from the expert. But before we actually start our lecture session, I would like to introduce you the moderator and also the speaker. So for the moderator, here we go. We will have Bu Mahendrawati ER, Ph.D. She is an associate professor in Information System Department and also the lecturer of Enterprise System course program. And she has a lot of research experiences in business process management, such as being a lead researcher for framework for business process management implementation in Indonesia in 2016 and until 2018. And she has also a lot of publications, such as Model for BPM Implementation Assessment, Evidence from Companies in Indonesia in 2019. Also, the topic of process mining also published in Journal of Enterprise Information System in 2018. She published books such as Business Process Management in 2018 and also Supply Chain Management with her husband in 2017. And for the speaker, we'll have someone that really special for today. We will have Caspar Jans, MSCC SCB, Senior Director, Transformation Solution EMEA at Software AG. He is an advisor and consultant of transformation solutions, especially in aligning organizations in business process during IT implementation. First, he has a lot of experiences with more than 2 years of process management and improvement experience, from being SAP Project Auditor Manager until Global Manager BPM COA. Caspar Jans has completed his master program in Industrial Engineering and Management Science in TU Eindhoven, Netherlands. Also, he has a lot of certificates, such as Lean Six Sigma Black Belt, ABICS Certified Supply Chain Professional with more than 10 years, and also Certified Facilitator for Behavioral Change. So now, please welcome Bu Mahendra and also Caspar Jans.
Thank you very much for a very nice introduction, Bu Ika, and also Pak Mukhlasan. Actually, I'm just here as being the messenger. I think we really am very fortunate to have Caspar to agree and give us this talk. I'm just, contacting and ask him to do it. And he is very kind to say yes. So here you are now. And as I mentioned to you, we will have around 100 minutes for us to discuss about this BPM and ERP. And I will really allow you to set your own pace, and that 100 minutes, we are hoping as well to have a lot of discussion with the audience. Just to give you an overview, at the moment, we already have around 100 or so participants, and they are from ITS students, but also from outside ITS. So actually all over Indonesia. So, Caspar, without further ado, I really would like to hear from you. So the time is yours.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much, Mahendrawati and Ika. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of my experience with you. So for me, it's an honor and a privilege to do that. Before I get into it, let me see if I can share my screen again. Are you seeing my screen with the title slides? That's check number one.
Yes.
Very good. Very good. Great. Well, thank you for the introduction. That slide will come back, but I'll skip it when it comes back in my own slide deck, so don't worry about that. So my name is Caspar. I'm more than happy to share some of my experience with you today. And it's all around ERP implementation challenges. And the way that I will build up my story is going to be, I'll be explaining a little bit around ERP and the challenges that you have. I will go a little bit into BPM, and then I will come to I would say that the most important part is the combination of the two, and how can a BPM mindset, a BPM approach help your ERP implementation projects. And then I will go into a use case from the company that I've spent virtually 20 years in, which is a Dutch manufacturing company called DSM. And they went through a couple of different SAP implementations in their past, and I was actually part of those projects. And I'll show you a little bit the approach we took and what kind of benefits that gave us. Now, having said that, let's start with a quick quote. If you don't know Anthony Robbins, you might know Tony Robbins. It's the same person. It's the one of the most famous motivation coaches, I think, in the world. And he basically says every problem is a gift, because without them, we would not grow. And I can assure you that consultants active in ERP problems, they grow very much because there is always a lot of problems. But then again, those are challenges. If you look at the title of today's presentation that I can do with you, there's two main parts in it. The first one is ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning. And I'll come back to that in my first major part, so to speak. The second part is business process management. And I think it's very good to make a distinction between the two, because the two world leaders on ERP and on business process management are not the same company. And I always make a point of it to stress that, because everybody knows SAP. What a lot of people don't know is that the word SAP stands for, in German then, Systeme, Anwendungen und Programmen für Dateibearbeitung, which in English means systems, applications, and programs for data processing. That's where SAP stands for. And they are very well known all over the world. I think the least well-known $1 billion company in the world is Software AG. That's where I work. And we are the world's leader when it comes to business process management software. And just to make sure that I also satisfy my marketing colleagues, because I always need to do that, just 2 slides on what Software AG is, and then I'll go into the ERP part. Just to make sure that you know where I come from. So Software AG is already a company that's around for 52 years. So in 1969, there was a professor, Professor Peter Schnell, who actually thought that data, and as a result also software, would become one of the most important assets in the world. This was in a time before I even was born. It was in a time that computers were certainly not a common practice. So it was really a visionary statement. And this person was also very much in tune with nature, as you can see from the picture on the top left, which actually is our head office in Darmstadt in Germany, which has a hexagon shape. It's only 2 floors, 2 stories high. So it's a very modest headquarters, which is typical for the company that we are. We have around 5,000 people. We are close to $1 billion revenue. So we're big enough to make a difference. We're small enough that we do need to care about our customers. We also partner up very much, and we have a very active community of people that use our products all over the world. Now, there's 3 main product lines that we do, and the last one is the one that I'll be talking about today. So APIs, integration, microservices, that's all about getting system integration set up. Web Methods is, I think, the most well-known brand that we have there. IoT and analytics, we're talking about streaming analytics, so real-time data analysis. IoT with the Cumulosity platform, very much used in the manufacturing environments. And then business transformation, which is home to Ares and Alphabet, Ares being the business process management platform that we have, which has been there for 25 years almost. Good. Having said that, let's get away from Software AG and go back into what we need to do. So the introduction, I'll skip in a minute because Ika very nicely already did that. So first I'm going to go into the ERP implementations, then the BPM part, then in the joining forces part, I will combine the two and end with a real life use case. I think together with Mahendrawati, we agreed that after each of those main topics, I would just shut up for a second to see if there's any questions that we should answer or can answer in between. Right, that you already seen, so that's not interesting. Let's start with the ERP part. And I need to just do some timekeeping on my own. Okay, good. So ERP implementations are very complex. And you heard about them probably already, but what is the reality of ERP implementations? Of course, it's not all bad, but it's certainly not all good. And if you look at some of the most impactful and big, I would say, failures in ERP, you will find out that the gravity and the impact of a failed ERP implementation is actually huge. For instance, LeasePlan, which is a lease company, they lease cars and buildings and stuff. They had to write off 92 million euros on their ERP implementation simply because it failed. Miller Coors, which is a brewery in the US, same thing, $100 million lawsuit against the partner that did the ERP implementation because it failed to deliver what it needed to do. Revlon, well known, I think, from the makeup industry, millions of dollars of lost sales. And I think one of the biggest one is actually a retail chain in Germany and Western Europe called Lidl, or Lidl, but we call it Lidl. They stopped their ERP implementation halfway through the program and wrote off 500 million euros in the process. These are all, by the way, SAP related, but I'm sure that we will see the same thing with Oracle and JD Edwards. It has nothing to do with the program itself. And that's also, it has nothing to do with the program. It has nothing to do, or almost nothing, with incompetence or bad intentions on behalf of the people implementing it. It has everything to do with the fact that there's enormous complexity when you talk about an ERP implementation. And I think that when you look at those ERP implementations, where is this complexity coming from? In other words, what are the sources of variability that you get that increase that complexity very quickly and very rapidly? And the first one, I think, is in the organizational dimension. As you can imagine, ERP implementations is something that typically happens within large organizations. If you're a middle or a small company, so small or medium enterprise, doing ERP doesn't make any sense because you're going to be increasing your overhead in your organization to an extent that it's no longer sustainable. So you look at large organizations. Now, large organizations typically have matrix kind of organization structures. So if you take a very simple example, there is top management. Let's see if I can have a laser pointer. I can. So there's top management. And then typically the matrix consists out of a functional axis where you have a division or distribution of people according to functional groups. So there's our marketing and sales, manufacturing, procurement, R&D, and then there is, of course, numbers more. So I'm not talking about HR and legal and finance. They also are all there, but I just want to keep it a little bit comprehensible. And then the other axis is very often the business unit or the business line or division, whatever you want to call it, axis that says, well, I have a business unit. In this case, I have 3. And then what you see is that, for instance, if you look at manufacturing, manufacturing units are very often linked directly to the business unit. So if you make different products, there's a very big chance that you have different manufacturing setups. From a marketing and sales point of view, though, it might be that your products in Unit A and Unit B are actually very, very familiar and very close to each other so that you can combine marketing and sales efforts. So you have people selling both products from Unit A as well as from Unit B. Unit C, on the other hand, is something completely different again. So they have their own marketing and sales unit. Procurement, certainly when you talk about the indirect procurement, so everything which is not raw materials or packaging, is something that is typically centralized in a shared service approach, because indirect procurement is something that is standard all over the world. It's the same all over the world. There are some national regulations and some small differences, but in essence, the procurement process is the same everywhere. So you can centralize that. R&D, same thing, just the kind of setup as marketing and sales. You might want to combine the R&D for certain products because they have a lot in common, or you might have separate ones. Now, the problem then starts to occur is when you start to scope and plan. Let me just go back to. So when you scope and plan your ERP implementation, so imagine you want to roll out ERP over this organization, and you typically don't do it for the entire organization in one go. So you need to make a choice. And the question is, are you doing it by function? So are you going to plan and scope it by function? First, we're going to do marketing and sales. Then we're going to do manufacturing. Then we're going to do procurement, then R&D. And then we have a couple more, of course. Or do you take a business unit approach? So listen, we first want to make sure that business unit A is migrating into ERP, or you upgrade from SAP ECC6 to SAP for HANA, which is a equally complex project. Or even, and then there's another question, is how do you deal with the shared service centers? Because if you go into business unit A and you take that business unit approach, how do you deal with the marketing and sales unit for A and B, which is a combined unit? Are you going to say half the people you need to work in ERP and the other half you need to do it old school? Or do you take that whole unit in one go? But then you're going to have some alignment issues for the people that work for unit B because they are not yet into the ERP system. So there is a lot of complexity already simply by the fact the way that organizations are structured. So they are organized. So that is one dimension that increases complexity. Another dimension is simply the geographical dimension. As you can imagine, large organizations have a footprint all over the world. So if we take a look at that business unit ABC again, they might have production locations, they might have sales offices, they have a headquarter, and it can be all over the world. And then again, the question becomes, how do you scope and plan your ERP implementation? And that's on top of, or actually in combination with, your organizational dimension. Because here you have basically another two choices. Are you still going by unit, meaning that you want to do an ERP implementation for all locations of one unit in one go, or maybe even in a phased approach? Or do you do it by country or by region? So you can have a lower number of people doing the implementation and they move from location to location and from country to country. Of course, that means that for each region, you can have multiple business units that are active in there. And by doing that, you need to be very careful in what part of what business unit are you going to do when you visit a certain region. So one thing is very clear. You cannot do it all at once at the same time and in all locations together. It's simply not doable. Yes, of course, you can increase the number of people you have in the project. And by doing that, you would be able to do multiple locations at a time. But I can assure you then the cost for the ERP project will be skyrocketing because these kind of consultants that help you with ERP implementations are anything but cheap. So you need to make, in the end, you need to make choices. And it is in those choices that makes also ERP implementations typically take a very long time. For instance, I'm working with a Swedish client right now that just started a migration project from an older version of SAP into S/4HANA. And they actually plan 8 years to do the entire global footprint of their company. And this is a sizable company, but not even a huge one. And that already takes about 8 years. Now, there's a couple of things that if you have that complexity in mind, so there will be a number of rollout challenges. At the moment that you start rolling out your ERP project, there's a couple of things that you need to take into account as a project team. And the first one, it sounds a bit lofty, but it's called afterlife. And what do you do after the moment that you've finished all of your go lives? And how do you deal with the system? How do you deal with the processes? So that is one. I'll get into all of these three in the next slides. The second one is also an interesting one. Who's leading who? In other words, do you take the lead and the suggestions from the ERP vendor or its consultants? Or do you take the organization and the way it works as a leading perspective when you start doing the implementation? And it's of course, it's a bit nuanced. So it's not straightforward. Of course, why should it be straightforward? I mean, we're talking about ERP. And the last one is the knowledge transfer dilemma. How do you make sure that the knowledge that you have is transferred to the right people? So let me get into those real quick. First of all, the afterlife. Implementing an ERP system is one thing, but keeping it up to date is a very, very different animal. Because in every project, and let me just illustrate that a little bit. So here's your project timeline for your ERP project. And as I mentioned, this can be multiple years, sometimes more than a decade. And you will see that in my use case that I'll be doing somewhere around the end. And in this project, during this project timeline, you will have a project world. This is the group of consultants, the group of people within the business units that are actively and typically also full-time working on the ERP implementation. Then, of course, you also have the running business world, meaning business goes on as usual. If you produce and sell products and services, that still needs to happen. You cannot put your business on hold for a couple of years until you've done your ERP implementation. Business as usual keeps on going. And then, of course, one of the first things that you do in an ERP project on a very high level is you do process design. So which processes are we going to be supporting by ERP, and how should they look like? And as a result of that, what kind of system development should I be doing? And I'll come back to that later as well. And then once you get into that system development part to a point that you say, okay, we're almost ready, that also means that the information that you have, so the configuration information, the process design, that all is documented somewhere in a database. It's typically done in a BPM platform, at least if you're wise and smart about it. And from a system development, you have, of course, your development SAP system. I'll just use SAP as an example and as an equivalent of ERP. So you have an SAP development or project system, but typically a development system that you're starting your development with. And at the same time, you design your processes and you document them in a BPM platform. At a certain point in time, you get to the end user training. So you're at the end of your first wave, sorry, you want to train the users. I mean, they need to start working in a different way. They need to find their way into the system, and they need to be supported. And at a certain point in time, there's your first go live. So your first wave of SAP systems, or typically one system, is going live. And from the moment that you go live, you typically also have hypercare or after go live care or aftercare or whatever you want to call it. But at the moment that people start working in the new way of working in the new system, there will be a lot of questions, certainly in the first 2-3 weeks. And you need to do hypercare. And that might drag on a little bit longer than you would like in certain cases. What also happens at just before the first go live is that you move the information from both the process perspective as well as from the system perspective into a production system. And typically there is a quality and assurance system in between. And for the process part, it's typically a project database, and you move that information into your production database. Meaning that people that are in scope for the go live, they can work in a production system and they can get their process documentation and information from a BPM platform that's in production as well. Now, so far, it's all quite straightforward. However, then, and typically also already earlier, you start working on the second wave. Maybe the second business unit or a second functional domain, depends on the approach that you've chosen. And you do another set of process design and system development, because that second business unit might be completely different than the first business unit. Or marketing and sales, of course, are completely different processes than manufacturing or procurement. And that project group that's working on that second part, of course, is also working in that project database and in that development system. So now you already have a production system, and next to it, a project system or a development system that is being actively changed. And again, certain point in time, you have end user training, you're going to have your second go live, and all of the delta that you've done in those development systems needs to go into production as well. Meaning that even in some cases, and I'll come back to that later, it means that you already make changes to the processes and the system configuration compared to the first go live that you did. So you need to retrain sometimes people in the first go live with the things that you've learned and you change for the second go live. And this goes on and on until you have finally your and final go live, which might be a long way from here. And every time that you have a go live and every time you have a wave, you're going to be working in your development system and you're going to merge that into your production system. So your production system and your production BPM database will constantly change during the process and the lifespan of this project. This is what makes it very important to have a very good management of change process in there. Because on top of the project changes, you will also have, and I'll come back to that later, but you will also have regulatory changes or fiscal changes imposed by your government. Or there is a continuous improvement project that says we need to change this process because it works better that way. Those changes need to be incorporated into the same production system in the end than all of the work that you're doing on your ERP part. So you have a production system and a production BPM platform that need to work together, and you need to keep that up to date. I just need to be conscious of time. So the unavoidable result that you have is that you will have different units in different locations on different versions of a process until way past the final go live. I mean, that I think is the key point from this part of the slide. And how would that look like? Just as an example. So here's that same timeline again. And we have the three units, and I just, for ease of simplicity, I took 3 locations per unit. At the start of your process, before the first go live, you decided that location 1 for unit A and location 1 for unit B and the entire unit C is in scope for the first go live. So they work in the old way of working. And unit A might have a different one than unit B, might have a different one than unit C. So that's why they have a different version number. And then at a certain point in time, they go live. So unit A in location 1 goes live with the new way of working. So does unit B, and so does the entire unit C. And they all are on the same version 1 for the new way of working. Then unit location 2 for unit A is still on the old way of working. That might be different than location 1, because location 1 would be in Europe, location 2 would be in China. They work in different ways, but they also go to the new way of working. However, because you learned from the first go live, you already incorporated some changes and some improvements into the processes. So that is version 1.1. So already location 1 and location 2 within the same business unit are still on slightly different versions of a process. The same goes for location 3 and so on. So if you look at the way that these things typically build up, that at the end of the last go live, you hope to have everything on the new way of working, same version. In this case, I chose version number 2. But what does that mean for your lifespan of your project? That means that at the start of the project, you have 6 old ways of working and no new way of working you have to manage yet. So this is basically the status quo that you had before you started the project. After your first go live, the number of old ways of working reduced to 4, and you introduced 1 new way of working. So you're still managing 5 different ways of working, basically. After the third go live, in this case, you only have 2 old ways of working left, location 2 and 3 in unit B. They're still on the old way of working, but you already have 3 new way of working versions active, 1, 1.1 and 1.2. And then finally, just before the last go live and after the last go live, you have no old ways of working, and you have hopefully 1 new way of working. So that dynamic of being able to maintain and support a combination of old ways of working and new way of working in your system and in your process repository is something that puts an enormous stress and strain on the maintenance organization in any major company. And this is also one of the reasons why things very often go wrong, because it is very difficult and it's a lot of work to keep this structured and in a good way. Now, the second part that I mentioned is who's leading who, or better yet, who's leading? Is this the vendor consultant or is it the organization itself? And by leading, I mean whose perspective are you going to take when you look at how the processes should be done, how the system should be configured. If you would follow the ERP implement application, so let's say SAP, you're going to implement SAP. Now, SAP has a massive amount of experience in implementing ERP. You can rest assured that they actually did think about the processes that they have in their system quite thoroughly. So that means that they have a lot of predefined and standardized processes available in the ERP implementation, and they are based on many years of implementing it around the world. They also are able to virtually, in an infinite number of cases, do customization. So if it's not in there by default, SAP will tell you, we can customize it. But there's a big danger to that. And then thirdly, they do have, and that's the downside of having the ERP application being leading, is they have limited specific organization and industry and region knowledge. Those last two is quite all right, but the organization knowledge, of course, with that SAP has about another organization is obviously rather small. Now, the other side of the spectrum, of course, is that you follow the organization itself. So let's say the old way of working. The organization has an infinite amount of knowledge about their own processes, their own products, their own markets, their own industries and regions. They know what they need to do. Also, they very often claim to be special, which is hardly ever true. And I've had these discussions very often in my years in DSM, where I needed to tell people, well, here's a standard process, you can use this. Yeah, but we're special. And then you go down into the details, and it turns out that they're actually not special, they're just perfectly normal, which is good. No judgment there. A problem, a challenge that the organization might have is that they suffer from the not invented here syndrome. It's very difficult for people, from a human behavior point of view, to adapt to something that you didn't invent yourself. Because when that happens in your brain, people think, well, why should I change to something that I didn't come up with? What's in it for me? And so a lot of emphasis, a lot of effort needs to be put in to make sure that you take people on the journey with you and explain to them, why are you doing this and what does it mean to them? How is it going to change the way that they work? What kind of benefits are they likely to be seeing from the new way of working and the new ERP system? But you can imagine that the balance and the choice between the two is not straightforward. And I'll come back to that, because you don't have to choose either one. The reality is it's a combination. But I'll come back to that later on. Having said that, are there any questions until this point of time? Mahendrawati?
No, at the moment, there's no questions. So I think you can carry on with the BPM.
Okay, good. So I confused them enough. That's good.
No. Well, they're starting their practice of SAP. So I think they're already confused with SAP. So
yeah. Well, SAP can be very confusing, but let me share a very brief personal story from the days that I was in university, which actually was in the previous millennium, but let's not dwell on that. We were having a course that was called Material Movement Management. And it was a heck of a course. So we needed to calculate MRP schedules by hand and all of that. And of course, SAP was mentioned in there as well. And at that time, when I was still young, I thought, well, that can never work. How can an application dictate the way an organization works? Now, then fast forward a couple of years, I moved to DSM, so my second employer in my career. And the first project I get put into is the SAP implementation that we had. And during that implementation, I came to realize that it actually is quite impressive what SAP did, is to build an application that is facilitating such an interconnected world in an organization. So it really connects procurement to finance, to HR, marketing and sales, R&D, production planning, all of that is in there. And of course, it's not perfect, but no two companies are exactly the same. But some of the core things that companies do is basically always the same. So I really made a switch and became, I wouldn't say a fan, but certainly have a certain amount of respect for ERP platforms, because they do manage quite an impossible task. Now, thank you. That's a good motivation for them, I think. Yeah. Well, my pleasure. I think that's what we're here for today. Right, now let's get into the second one, and just excuse me for a second. Let's go into BPM. And of course, you know what BPM is, but I do feel compelled to put this slide on the screen. In the industry, and if you look into into the research and maybe not the academic world, because they know the difference, but certainly the commercial part, is that there is a lot of confusion about what is BPM versus BPMS, and they are not the same. I'm very vocal about that. Sometimes I feel a little bit like Don Quixote with the windmills, but BPM is, and I will explain that later, is a management philosophy. It's a way of working where you put the process central. BPMS is a workflow system. I don't want to make it smaller than it is. It does wonderful things, but it's the automation of workflow in processes. And very often when organizations talk about BPM, and certainly I mean vendors, when they talk about BPM, they mean BPMS. So if you see a headline that says, is RPA then the BPM killer? Then clearly that the person or the company that wrote that down have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. That RPA is again, one of the tools that you can use within the larger BPM framework. But if you say RPA versus BPMS, that becomes a more relevant comparison. Now, having that out of the way, what do we think at Software AG and me personally as well, what is the core belief of BPM? It evolves around the business processes. That means that it is a management discipline. It's a way of life where an organization chooses to recognize that the business processes that they have are actually assets. And everything that they have and everything that they do is either done via a process or connected to a process. And ultimately, the assets that they have, they contribute directly to your performance as a company. And they do that by driving operational excellence and business agility. I'll come back to that in another picture that I think explains it even better. But BPM in the end will give you flexibility and agility, which is really counterintuitive. Because if you say BPM to people who know a little bit about it, they will say, oh, it's process documentation, it's process modeling. Well, it's a fundamental, but it's only it's a means, it's not the goal. You need to do that in order to be able to take all the benefits from BPM in a business. Continuous improvement, manageability, and harmonization of your processes are all things that you can do when you look at an organization from a BPM perspective. So when you do BPM, that doesn't mean that you cannot be agile. I would rather actually argue the opposite. If you want to be agile, you need to do BPM in order to have a good, decent foundation on which you can be agile on. Now, having said that, it's all connected. Means that a lot of things that make up an organization are connected to each other. So if you take a very conceptual definition of a process where you have input, you have value-adding activities, one, multiple, and you have output. That's basically what a process is all about. But in order to do those value-adding activities, you need resources. A resource in the form of people, equipment, materials, energy, you name it. And if you don't have people and you don't have equipment and you don't have input, there is nothing to transform into output. Those value-adding activities, they also generate and use data in all kinds and forms that you have. If you look at ERP implementations, most of the data is actually in the ERP. However, if you look at the marketing and sales process, or sometimes called order to cash, that very often starts with a lead and an opportunity that are actually managed in a CRM application, for example, Salesforce. And that information then needs to be transferred somehow into your SAP part, where you do the transactional execution of the order to cash process as a sequence. So you have data, and you have multiple applications using that data. And sometimes you have data being used in multiple applications, or you have multiple applications using the same data. But certainly you need to manage all of this. And if you then take a look at what BPM is, then BPM typically focuses on the resources part, the process part, and sometimes even the data part as well. The application part is something that typically is a given in BPM, where you say, listen, I do define for each activity in my process which application is supporting it, but the IT portfolio management part and your enterprise architecture part is something that's typically done in a separate domain. It's called IT portfolio management or enterprise architecture, whatever you want to call that. And that profession with the enterprise architects, they take care of the fact that all of your applications are actually on the latest versions, well organized, have update schedules, security checks in place. That is something that typically BPM doesn't look at. Now, just to have said that. Then all of that, if you look at an organization point of view, it all links together. And typically organizations start, or certainly have, a business strategy or a business model. So how do you want to win in the marketplace? That's what you would like to understand. And in order to realize that strategy, companies translate that strategy into an operating model. And an operating model is nothing more and nothing less than how are we organizing ourselves? What's our way of working? There's a couple of different frameworks that you can use for an operating model. So the 5-star by Galbraith is one, McKinsey has a 7S model, but they all basically say the same thing. There are a number of different components that you need to organize. And one of those components actually is your business processes and your system landscape. That is one thing that you need to have, because nowadays, there are not many companies that have processes in place that are not supported by a system. And actually, I did run into one yesterday where I was having a discussion with a big pharmaceutical company in Belgium, where we were looking at the quality management part of lab research, where we found out that the recording of the results of the lab tests that they did was actually done on paper. And they actually had 1.2 billion pages of documentation for each product that they had so far. And they were now in the process of moving that into a digital way of keeping track. So we still have organizations that do things on paper, but you can also realize that nowadays it's not sustainable from an environmental perspective, because that's half a rainforest if you need 1.2 billion pages. But it's also not sustainable in the form of it's physically in one location. And how do you make sure that everybody who needs it, that might be all across the world, can access it? I mean, if the COVID pandemic learned us one thing, it's that it's going to be a hybrid way of working. I've been working from home for the last 15 months, while before that, I traveled 3 to 4 days a week within EMEA. Now, so we have business processes, system and data landscapes, and on top of that, or as a foundation, if you want, there is governance. And governance is crucial. Governance organizes who is owning what process, who is owning what application. So at the end, who has the accountability in case you need to make a very tough decision. So governance is quite crucial. I'll come back to that in a minute. And as another foundation, there's application and operational excellence. So once you get to that point where you say, I have everything documented, I have everything managed, I have everything optimized, how do I keep it in that shape? But the realization of your strategy in the end happens only in one place, and that is in execution. In the execution of all of your processes on the shop floor, in the offices, on all levels in the organization, actually. But from the process to the execution, that's one step too far. It's too big of a gap. So what you typically have in between is another set of more detailed documents called standard operating procedures or work instructions. And from an application point of view, you talk about system integration. And that's your bridge into execution. Now, the BPM mindset basically says you better start documenting your business strategy from that level on in your BPM platform. You translate it into an operating model, you detail it out into your processes, into your application libraries, and then you add the work instructions to the activities, and that's what you can do in execution. And if you have an ERP implementation, those business processes are there, the work instructions are there, and those work instructions basically say, in this transaction, click that button, then do this, then press save, and you've executed this transaction. And interestingly, by the way, if you talk about the Aris product I mentioned earlier, it's actually integrated with SAP if you want, that you can start an SAP transaction right out of the BPM platform. That makes it even easier for people to switch between, let's say, learning about what they need to do and actually doing it. Now, I still have some gap on the left, so let me fill that in. Execution nowadays also has a number of technologies that either help it or learn from it. And just to put them into the right perspective, also for you, because it took me also a couple of years to figure out how everything works together, is you have two different sets of technologies, roughly speaking. There is the technology stack that helps your execution capabilities. And then we talk about RPA, we talk about process automation. I remember that BPMS I mentioned, that's process automation. RPA, of course, is simply taking out human activity and replace it by some lines of code. That's what RPA is, nothing more, nothing less. But that also means that at the moment that you're going to start changing your process, which is supported by RPA, you need to make sure that you also investigate if there's a potential impact on your RPA code, to make sure that once you do change the process and you go live with that new process, that your RPA still works, and the other way, of course, works as well. So that also means that organizations that go blindly and feet first into RPA, they will be successful until the point that they either cannot oversee anymore how many RPA bots they've implemented, or they are changing processes or applications that have an impact on your RPA bot. So that's important that is connected. The second technology stack is the group of technologies that take information from execution and they put that into knowledge. And then I'm talking about the mining technologies, process mining, process discovery, which is also sometimes called task mining. We don't want to make it too easy for you. So we call task mining, it's the same as process discovery. And IoT, of course. And IoT is a little bit a mix, a hybrid, I would say, but let's focus on the mining part. So what process and task mining do is they basically read the log files that you have in an ERP system or in any other system, actually. And what they do is they rediscover and reconstruct the way that the processes were actually executed. Meaning that you can write down the way that you want the process to be executed in your repository. So which is actually, let me just point that out if I can find my own mouse. Where's my mouse? There's my mouse. So your designed process is right in here. Process mining will tell you, well, this is how it actually took place. And trust me, that might be different. And I'll have an example of that later on. And then, of course, the mining and also a little bit of IoT, they will give you input into continuous improvement. Because with process mining, you can get very quickly insight in why is this one process taking 3 days to execute in business unit A and 12 days in business unit B. What are the differences? And what can we learn from business unit A that we can replicate to business unit B? Which, of course, as you can imagine, is also important for your ERP implementation, because if you've done A and B and you see these kind of differences, you might need to revisit the way that unit B has been implemented. So this is what we call, actually, this is what I call the big picture. This brings together your BPM view with a lot of different tools that are very often positioned by vendors in the commercial market as one-stop shop solutions. So if you implement process mining, we give you full transparency and we can automate everything for you. Yes, but they forget to mention that you also need to document and manage and optimize all of those things that you're automating. And some of them cannot do that, and they will also not talk about that. And as a result, after a year or 2 years, you're going to run into a wall and you need to redo a lot of work, and which makes your process mining project quite expensive in the end. Good. Having said that, when we talk about a business process, let's just very briefly visit the process lifecycle. And I'm sure that most of you already know all this, but this is the way that we look at this, at least. So we start, just for the ease of the conversation, we start with the process design and the documentation part, which we call process management and governance. And then those processes are implemented in systems of records, transactional systems, SAP, Salesforce, Ariba, Dynamics, you name them. That's what we call process implementation and execution. And this is already where process mining comes into play. What can we learn from the actual execution when we talk about process discovery and root cause mining? So taking that burden away when you're doing a Lean Six Sigma project, the first thing you do is you do data dumps and you go into Minitab or SPSS and you do a whole bunch of Pareto analysis and root cause analysis. Process mining can take a part of that away from you and help you do that much quicker. And then from a process mining perspective, there's typically two ways organizations go next. I think the most common one is that they use process mining and certainly task mining to find out we need to do this differently or we can actually automate this. And then they go into RPA and they use it to do process automation. On the other hand, if you go the improvement route, then very often you find the improvement, you model the improvement and you run a simulation on it. It could be a single run, it could be a scenario analysis. And at the moment that the simulation confirms to you that your suggested improvement probably will give you the benefits that you're looking for, you go into your process design, you change your process, you roll it out, you change your system if need be, and then a couple of months later, you will see the results of that change back in process mining. And this cycle just is continuous. Just to give you that little bit of idea with you. Now, just looking at the time, okay, I'm good. An important aspect or an important component in BPM, I think, is what we call process classification. Because this has an impact on answering the question, who's leading? And I'll come back to that later on. So when you look at the business processes, they're not all equal. They are different. You have, first of all, a distinction between differentiating processes and non-differentiating processes. So the differentiating processes are the ones that give you a competitive advantage over your competitors. What are you doing specifically different than others? And then the non-differentiating processes, as you can imagine, are the ones that are, let's say, more common. HR, IT, legal, finance, indirect procurement. These are all processes that they are still important. You still need to do them as cost efficiently as possible, but they will not give you a competitive advantage. So there's also different ways that you need to approach those type of processes. And then within the non-differentiating processes, there's another distinction between single standards and modular standards. Forget that for now for a little bit, but single standards are basically the real standardized processes. Procure to pay, employee onboarding, IT ticket handling. All of those are so standard that you simply use an off-the-shelf solution for that. You take the standard SAP process, you implement it, and you do not allow any deviations. I'll come back to that in a minute. Modular standard, by the way, is also standardized components, but they are only mandatory if they are applicable. And just as an example for you, the company I used to work for, DSM, consisted out of 8 different business units, business groups, we call them. We had about 25,000 people working and about 10 billion of revenue. So we were a sizable company, not small, certainly not huge. And we had one business group that actually sold their products per train wagon. So a customer would buy 1, 2, 3x train wagons of material. That's how bulk that material was. The way that you handle train wagons in SAP is something that SAP can do for you. And we standardized that during the project. And we only had one business group that actually used it. So only that business group needed to use that process. All of the other ones didn't need to use it. Now, imagine that another business group would be coming into the company via an acquisition that also would have train wagons handling. They would need to comply to that way of working. There was no exception if they used it. So that's a bit the modular standard thing. Now, I think I'm almost through with the BPM part as well. The last thing is, I think that governance, and then I think management of change will come after that. So I talked about the governance earlier. When you talk about governance, it's about who's responsible for the content of your processes. And of course, you have multiple levels. On the highest level, which typically is called level 0, you have your process hierarchy or your portal, or it's the highest level of aggregation where you say, well, these are the processes and maybe even some end-to-end processes that we will have in our organization that we need to achieve our strategy. And that is, in this case, I call that the Process Governance Board, which is a group of people typically chaired by a member of the managing board with all of the global process owners and saying, okay, so this is what we need. Yes, good. Then you detail it out into end-to-end scenarios and functional domains for level 1. Level 2 is your end-to-end scenario, a single scenario, and then level 3 to 5 are your single processes and the function allocation diagrams that you have to connect all of the pieces of information that you have in your organization right to an activity or to a process. And what you already also see in the governance part in reality is that your non-differentiating processes, your standard processes, are very often managed from a central perspective, from a corporate perspective. And the differentiating processes are handled by the business unit themselves. And they have more flexibility and freedom in the way that they shape and implement those specific differentiating processes. So from a governance perspective, process classification is quite important. Then I talked about the afterlife a little bit earlier. And I'll come back to it again, but just as a little bit of a concept. Every organization that executes processes will have incidents. At a certain point in time, an application will stop working the way it did yesterday. And you need to handle that. And very often there is a ticketing process for that. So you have a support desk, you put in a ticket and say, listen, order to cash, my order to cash delivery shipment creation is not working anymore. Please investigate. You can also have change requirements coming from continuous improvements or from fiscal or legal, and they have an impact on the same processes and the same applications potentially. So what you need to do, and what I've seen not only in companies that I worked in, but also customers I worked with, is that you need to have that central management of change process in place that says, whenever I need to change something, I need to do an impact analysis on both the process and the supporting applications. That's the only way to safeguard that my alignment between the process and the application, let's say the SAP system, remains intact. And then once you go into the design and build and test and deploy stages of a change, you get into that ERP orchestration layer, which I think in SAP terms is called the SAP Solution Manager, that helps you guide your change from development to quality to production. And if you really want to go all out and you want to have a great party, you add process mining into the mix to look at the SAP systems, your orchestration system, and your ticketing system to find out where are the biggest bottlenecks in my management of change process. This picture actually is a picture I created when I worked in DSM. We had a change process that took on average 9 months to complete for a change. We made some changes. We ended up in this situation, and we managed to reduce the 9 months to 3 weeks. We could even have a change completely done within 3 days if it was needed, because of, and that makes you much more agile. I mentioned that earlier. Business agility is depending on how well did you manage and document and all of your resources, your applications, your processes, your risks, your roles, well, you name it. So this is a key. This is also one of the most underrated processes that I come across in the organization. Nobody wants to spend time on management of change. It's not sexy. It's not interesting. It's not rocket science even. It simply needs to get done very well. Good. Now, what do you typically see when companies start adopting process management? The first stage that they do is typically process modeling. They're going to document all of the processes that they have. They do that as a discovery exercise, very often manually, and then they document it into a BPM platform. It's very often initiated from a finance or an IT middle management perspective. And at a certain point in time, you outgrow that. And you have everything documented and you want to get more out of it. So organizations move into that second phase called process management, where you also do the innovation, the standardization, the optimization of the way that you work. And this is very often where you have those SAP implementations that if you do an ERP implementation, you're typically into the process management stage in process management life. And you might have a center of excellence actually that reports already into senior management or into a function or a program. And then finally, your last step is enterprise management, where you also start bringing in the process mining part and the risk and control management part and a bit of dashboarding that you can do. And you start focusing on customer and employee journeys instead of a black and white process. And your whole process ownership also means that you have cross-functional budget control. So you have a process owner that actually has a budget to do process improvement. It's his or her decision to take and not any longer the business unit's decision that execute the process. So and the scope of this also becomes bigger and bigger. And you see that the Center of Excellence in an enterprise management phase actually reports typically into the managing board directly, because they realize that BPM has an impact on virtually everything, the same as an ERP implementation does. And that's why they go so good together. Now, having said all of that around BPM, are there any questions so far? Or
Yes.
is everybody still, good.
Quite a lot actually. So it's starting pouring in. So I will just invite them to ask you directly if you don't mind.
No, that's fine.
Achi, would you like to start, please?
Oh, hi, Bu Mahendra. Hi,
Hello.
Caspar.
Hi.
I can ask directly, Bu Mahendra. Thank you for the opportunity. So maybe I just want to know that if you find any gap on users' requirements, but we already have the standards for the applications. So how do you manage that? But actually, we have this slide that explain about the the UBS.
The classification part.
But I mean, how do you manage to develop to cover those gaps? I mean, like how far can we go to develop those gap on the requirements and the business standards actually?
Okay. Is it okay for you? Because I do have a slide on that in the joining forces part, to be honest. I'll come back to that. And if I haven't answered your question after the fourth part, make sure to ask the question again. I will answer it then. Right. But I think I will answer it along the way.
Okay.
All right. I'll note that down. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hang on, Achi. Okay. Yep. Now, Pak Arif, would you like to ask your questions directly?
Saya boleh menyapa, Bu.
Oh, yes. We have our head of department who would like to say hello to you. Just a moment.
Wow.
Hi.
Hello, Mr. Caspar.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad to have met you in this afternoon. I hope we can meet again for another session. Okay, thank you, Mr.
My pleasure. Nice to meet you too. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. I don't. Pak Arif, are you here? If not, I can just ask the question for you. He was asking about process mining would assume that the process is executed under the formal system. In reality, there is a situation where people do everything beyond the formal systems. For example, using paper-based files, spreadsheet, and how to assure that the process mining can be done correctly in this regard.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, to be honest. So yes, so the limitation of process mining is that whatever is not executed in the system that you're mining, you will not see back in the result. So that's an absolutely correct statement. The way to circumvent that, at least to a certain extent, is to use task mining in combination with process mining. So what task mining does is it basically looks over the shoulder of the user on what mouse clicks and what keyboard strokes is that user doing in what application and in what field of the application. Of course, this still does not cover any paper-based work. I mean, if it's paper-based, there's no way that you can mine it with a system. But if it is computer-based, and it doesn't matter if it's the ERP system, so imagine that you need to make a purchase order based on a contract, but you need to find the right contract first. Some organizations have another system for that, where they have their contract database. Process mining would only see the creation of the purchase order, but task mining would also see and record the fact that you move to another application, that you click left and right, and that you find the proper contract number, that you maybe copy it with Ctrl+C, and that you paste it in SAP. That information can be covered by task mining, and of course it can be anonymized, and it will only record the things that you wanted to record. So it's not a piece of spyware on your computer. It really helps you by focusing on what do you do to perform this activity, and then you can add that information in the end. The task mining can make a sort of a log file for you that can then be put into process mining as well to enrich it. So I hope that answers that question.
Yes, thank you. So moving on to the next question, Saide, or Mr. Saide, Pak Saide, he's actually joining from Taiwan, I think. Saide, would you like to ask your question directly, please? Hello?
Just read out loud, otherwise.
All right, okay, I will read it. It's interesting because you also have something to do with supply chain, and he's asking about, is there any significant change of BPM in normal versus crisis condition, the COVID like now? Which part of BPM is most crucial and how it can enhance SCM in crisis time?
Okay. Yeah, that's a whole different topic. I think we could talk hours on that alone. But I think in short, the part of BPM that I think is most important here is your risk and control management and your business continuity management. So what have you documented from a supply chain management point of view? If you need to change all of a sudden the way that you deal with exports, or the way that you deal with your production facility that needs to be COVID proof, so to speak. You need to have procedures in place, preferably documented in your BPM system around business continuity, that you can then follow and more quickly be able to make changes to it. And I think that comes back again to the statement I made earlier. If you want to be agile, and a lot of companies needed to be very agile at the start of the COVID pandemic, you need to have a very good foundation on what it is that you're doing, because it gives you a much quicker insight in where are the gaps that I'll be seeing, and what is the impact on it, and what do I need to change. So that I would like to keep it at that, otherwise I'll keep spending too much time on that topic,
okay,
which is very interesting.
We still have 2 more questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, sure.
So I will read it. Okay, Akmal, can you ask directly, please? He's one of the students. Akmal?
Okay, okay, thank you, Mr. Caspar and Mr. Mahendrawati for the occasion. So I have a question regarding the implementation of ERP system. Earlier before, I saw that Mr. Caspar have a 6 Sigma black belt title. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so how does 6 Sigma translate to the implementation of ERP system in an organization?
Well, the simple answer is not, to be very honest, because they are 2 very different things. Of course, they are slightly related, but not really. So in ERP implementation, you make sure that you, well, let me put it differently. You might be using Lean Six Sigma initiatives to find the best way of working that you then implement in ERP. But you can also implement ERP without Lean Six Sigma, and you can run Lean Six Sigma without ERP. Although from a Lean Six Sigma point of view, your ERP system, of course, gives you a lot of valuable data that you can use in your Lean Six Sigma project. So, so if you look at the DMAIC circle, the data and the measurement and the analysis part is very often done based on the data coming out of systems, and ERP, of course, is a very important one in that case. But formally, there is no direct relationship between Lean Six Sigma and ERP, in my view.
All right. Okay, last one. Kila, would you like to ask your question directly, please? Thank you, Akmal. If not, then I will read the question. How to, yes, is that Kila?
No, that was me. I said okay.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
How to deal with customers' negative perception towards our new business process. In the company where I work, it's a telco company, we implemented the process so-called deposit fund before the installation and services run in customer. Customer find the process is annoying and took time, while the management think it's good to make sure no investment lost and decrease the number of hit and run customers. Despite of this comply process, in fact, our sales decreased in such a big number. Oh no.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is a very typical situation. And the thing that I typically recommend then in that case is to look into customer journey management and really record the way that customers interact with the organization and record also what their perception is about it. If the customers are really not happy with a process that has been implemented by a business, it should be made very visually and very strongly visually that the customers are not happy. And you can do that, of course, via either doing interviews with customers or asking them to do a net promoter score at the end of each transaction. But you need to have some measurable data points that show that the customers are not happy. The management very often is blind to any kind of inconvenience for the customers because typically they themselves are not customers on that level. So that means that customer journey management and customer journey mapping. So what are my touch points between the customer and my internal business processes? And where does it very often go wrong? And how can I measure that and make that visual? That I think is the key to get out of that vicious circle where one group is blind and the other group is not happy. And so you will have a lot of hit and run customers. So customer journey management for me is the key to starting to unlock that problem.
All right, thank you. I think we'll allow you to carry on with the last part because this is, I think, very interesting as well.
Yeah. Now it all comes together. So thank you. So I'll continue this part. So two more parts. I call that joining forces. So what happens if you combine BPM and ERP? And finally, a real-life case where I show you a little bit of the complexity of the planning that we had to do in the SAP implementations in my DSM days. So I would like to take those two things together, and then at the end have the last Q&A. We can then use it until the session is done.
Okay.
All right. So first of all, I think there are 6 ways that you can accelerate an ERP implementation, and let me just highlight them first, and then go into more detail. So the first one is you have a single source of truth. So you have one repository that contains all of the information around your business processes, and there's one version for each object. It can be reused, of course, but there is a single source. Very important. So you don't have multiple versions laying around where people start working from the wrong version of a process or a activity. So that's one. I'll get back to all of these later on. Discovering the as-is situation. So getting transparency into how are we actually doing it today, so we can learn from that and say, okay, so what do we need to implement and where are the gaps to where we want to go. Another one is tracking progress. How to make sure that you have transparency in what organization part, what location is on what version of which process. Because that matrix becomes n-dimensional very quickly and very large. The fourth one is BPM can help you train the end users. So I'll come back to that as well. The fifth one is finding balance. And this is the one, just as a preview notice, this is the one where I go in and on how do you deal with, should I change a process? Should I change the way of working? So this is where that process classification comes back. And of course, keeping it up to date. And I think I already mentioned a lot about that, but that's about management of change. Now, let's start with the first one. So let's start with using BPM as a central repository in your design phase. So you might recognize that picture from one of the earlier slides where you have, and let me just put the laser pointer on. So you have your process design phases in your waves in your project. And remember, this can drag on for 5, 10, 12 years. That's not a problem with ERP. And you have this hybrid setup of I have a production database and also a production system, and I have a project database. And how do I make sure that every time that I start a new design phase, I have the latest knowledge available to start from? And so what you also very often see is that at the first go live, they clean up the project database with a copy of the production database, so that they know that at the moment that a new group of consultants start working on a new process design, that they start from exactly the right processes that they also have already in production. That's really key. So it's that stable foundation that you have for developing and rolling out your business processes. That's I think one of the main assets that BPM brings into ERP implementations. It's having that single repository. Everybody works from the same information. It's almost undescribable what kind of benefit that has and what kind of problems you run into if you don't have it. So that is one. Another one is discovering the old way of working via process mining. So if you look at traditional ERP implementations, is they look at the system alone. So if you already have SAP, for instance, so you're running an old version of SAP and you want to migrate into SAP from HANA, a commonly made mistake is that they only focus on what's in the old SAP system without questioning themselves, is this actually how it's being done? And is this the way that we want it to still be done? So a typical ERP implementation looks at the system. A better ERP implementation also includes the process documentation already in there, but they still both miss the way that the people actually work. And that is what BPM, including process mining, gives you, because it adds that part from reality in there. It tells you, well, this is your old SAP system, that's nice, and this is the design document that you configured, and this is the way it should be, that's all great, but this is the way that people actually worked. And let me just show you that with a little example. Here is an example of a process mining result for a simple procure-to-pay process. And this looks really nice and structured, but believe me, if you go to real life process mining results, it's a huge spaghetti. It's so big that you cannot hardly ever see that you have activities in there. Just as an example, I was working with a customer in the Middle East. They had a process that was executed 15,000 times in the data set that they gave us, and they managed to have 12,000 unique ways of executing that process. Now, in the picture that you see here on the screen, this, and I know that by heart, by the way, this has 73 variants, meaning 73 unique pathways from start, the green dot at the top, from here to the finish line, to the start, to the end, 73 different ways. But the question is, this is just variants for one process. And which one of these variants is actually the one that you want to have? Is it option 1? Is it option B? Or is it option 3? What is the process that you actually would like to configure and use in your new ERP system? And maybe it's a combination of two, because you have two locations that have quite different ways of working that you both want to facilitate. And you might have what they call a master and a variant combination, where you say, listen, I have a standardized process. So for instance, take option 1, that's a standardized process. A number of these activities also appear in option number 3, but option number 3 has a couple of different activities additionally. So you might want to say option 3 is a variant of my master process that I have in option 1. And that helps you again in getting much quicker through the analysis, and it also helps you in building let's say the change mindset within the users when they see that the way that they're working now is actually taking into account to design the way that it's going to be in the future. If it's only a couple of consultants from an external company coming in and saying to you, well, this is what you need to do, then I can assure you that people are not changing. So that's the second part. And then, of course, once that you have that, you can then document that process a little bit more nicely and say, listen, this is the way that we want to execute this process. And then you can enrich that with a lot of information. And then this becomes your baseline process for conformance checking. This becomes your baseline process for the system configuration in SAP. That's how easy it can be as well. It's just a lot of work. I can tell you that as well. Now, then the third one that we had was the keeping track of the progress. So you remember this picture that I've shown early on. What you would be able to do in the end is use your BPM platform and to say, and this is a little bit about a different topic, but it's the same concept, where you can say, listen, I have my models, level 1, level 2, who's responsible for level 2, when has this process been reviewed? And you can add stuff like, okay, has this process been configured in ERP? Has it been rolled out? And to what business unit or what countries has it been rolled out? So you can start using the information that you have in your ERP system, and in this case, via process mining again, or via simple data analysis, and you bring that visually into your BPM platform. So the whole project team and the responsible management in the business have one place where they can see, okay, so the rollout for my unit, for my locations has been planned for these and these and these quarters in the next couple of years. That makes it much more transparent. And it saves you from having to build all of that process, that progress tracking and progress reporting, again, separately in either Excel or PowerPoint. I mean, ERP consultants love PowerPoint and Excel. All consultants do. But it's not as efficient as if you can use the native applications that actually is also managing the processes itself. So that is one thing that BPM can also help you. Another one is on the end user training, because it means role-based training. At the moment, human adoption, and then I'll go back to the experience I have from facilitating behavioral change workshops, is that people change at the moment that their mind comes to the conclusion that they need to change, not because somebody else tells them they need to change. And so a trick that's very often used to change the behavior of people is to change the circumstances to such a degree that people themselves reach the conclusion that they need to change. It also helps, and that's another part, because we don't want to change the circumstances of people. You want to know that the person needs to have an idea and needs to be aware of the fact, what is my input, what is my contribution in this process, and how does it help me if I work in a different way? So that's what people really would like to see. So that means that if you look from that perspective, the process provides a better context than a work instruction or a simple set of instructions that they have. So ultimately, based on the roles that a person has in the processes, your training scope is immediately and fully determined. So imagine that you have a person that has the role of purchaser, so creation of purchase orders and other stuff. If you have that whole process hierarchy, a document in your BPM platform, basically going to that purchaser role object, you can immediately see these are the activities that person needs to be doing. And then you can have the training material for each of those activities at your fingertips. And whether you do that via class training or individual training or self-training or YouTube videos, that's all up to the decision of course, the organization. Sorry. But in the end, it's taking people along in the journey through the process that they actually execute. It gives them a much better grasp on what it is they're doing, what their part in the total picture is. Because you can imagine that if you are one person in a company that employs 100,000, you might feel like a very small little piece of the whole puzzle. And that's what you need to, I would say, artificially increase that people think that they play a significant piece of the puzzle. So that from an end user perspective. So BPM can help you scope and also provide a part of the training on the processes and the things you need to do for the people. And then I think one of the most important ones is the process classification to find the right balance and to answer the question, who's leading? So that means that, again, here come the three different types of processes that I mentioned earlier. So I have standardized processes, I have the modular standards, and I have the unique business processes. And just to give you an idea of what that means between the two extreme ones, procure to pay, as you know, is a standardized process. But still, we had a unique business process variant for one of our business units for procure to pay. And it was a very stupid thing. Procure to pay itself is quite standardized. However, we had one business group in DSM that creates the strongest fiber in the world. It was called Dyneema. And one of the applications of Dyneema was actually the inserts that you use in bulletproof vests. That's the material that stops the bullets. They're also used on the inside of tanks and police boats and stuff like that. You want to test your own product. So every plant that creates Dyneema, that produces Dyneema within DSM, has a firing range in the basement of the production plant. And if you want to do firing tests, you need ammunition, you need bullets. You might go into the first Walmart in the US and you buy a pack of ammunition. In Europe, and certainly in the Netherlands, where this product was invented, that is certainly not the case. It has an entire set of licenses and government regulations attached to it. So to facilitate the purchasing of ammunition for the firing range, we needed to have a completely unique business process. It was a variant of the master process for procure to pay, as I mentioned earlier, because most of the steps were the same, but we had to add a couple of steps to get that process on the road as well. And then you see that even a procure to pay process might have a variant as a unique process. It really depends on the situation of the business. Now, coming back to this question, so the first step that you typically do to say, okay, who's leading, is to figure out what default process does the ERP vendor provide out of the box. So if you implement a completely clean SAP system, what kind of procurement process can you do with SAP? And I can tell you that's already a couple of different ones, but the main one is simply there. And you do that step for each one of those processes, because you first want to know what is in the system that I've just spent millions of euros on, and can I use that? That's basically question number one. Question number two, of course, is does it fit with the intended way of working? So can we use this process and would it fit us? And that's where you see the first differences. So for the standardized processes, I would argue, yes, it fits. No questions asked. For the modular ones, it's a bit of a gray area. But for the unique processes, that fit is typically not all that good. So you might need to make some changes there. So that also means that what would be your initial course of activity or action when you deal with these three different types of processes? With standardized processes, actually, it's quite simple. You change the way of working to fit the out-of-the-box process. So in other words, for standardized processes, the application should be leading. For the unique business processes, you start to do configuration and customization to the system to fit the system to the way of working. So the process basically is in the lead. And for modular processes, you try to change the way of working if you can, and otherwise you configure, customize the system. And the reason why I typically say that you change the way of working first, because in the end and in the long run, that might be a cheaper alternative than doing configuration or customization, because in the end, customization really drives up the costs in the lifespan of the process of the product. Because you need to do with every change that you do, you need to also investigate all of the customization that you've done to see if it doesn't really interfere with the change that you're about to make. So to answer the question, who's leading? For standardized processes, I would argue that the ERP system is simply leading. You take what it has, you change your organization to work with it, and yes, you might do a little bit of configuration left and right, but certainly no customization. It's something that I would really not recommend. For the unique process, it's the organization, it's the process that leads. This is what we want to do, and what do we need to change to the ERP system to get it done? And it's a bit of black and white, but this is the gist of it. And then for modular processes, who's leading? I would say common sense. You look at, can I change the organization? What would that cost me in effort and in change management? Or do I need to do some configuration on the system? And which one of the two makes most sense in each individual case that you need to do? So I hope this answered the question that was posed earlier. If not, I'll hear that afterwards. And then the last one is keeping it up to date after go live. So we're back at the afterlife again. This is the picture that you saw before. It's all about those movements where you go from a design phase into a process repository for a design phase or for a production phase, and how do you deal with that? That is what your impact analysis. So that first step in your management of change process, that's a vital one. That determines what is my impact. Am I willing to accept that impact? Because the benefit that we think we're going to have from a change will be bigger than all of the effort we need to do to make the change. So that's certainly one thing that we do. So that's why management of change is also such an important process that very often is not maintained properly within an organization. And the worst thing that you can see, well, there are a couple of things that are not good when you look at organizations. One, they don't have a management change process. It's all ad hoc. Two, they do have them, but they haven't combined them. So they have a separate management change process for processes, and they have a separate one for IT. IT, and they're very important and very good people, but they tend to think only in IT terms without having any regards for the business side of things. So you need to combine them into one management change process. That is a key in becoming structurally agile as an organization. Having said that, let me just now, and I think, let me see, yeah, I got a couple of minutes left. That's good. Yeah. Share with you how we did it in DSM, starting already 22 years ago with this use case. So before I do that, I managed DSM. At that time, they were a chemical manufacturer, and then over time they changed into life sciences and nutrition. But they had 8 3-tier SAP landscapes and 2 mega projects to get all of that done. A rollout to 40 plus countries, and it was a combination of the global standards and the unique solutions. So what will you see? You will see different colors, and let's say the gray ones are the rollout projects. The blue ones were the project audits. That's the stuff when you saw in the introduction where I had the SAP audit manager. Those were my projects. And then the green ones were actually Delta projects for the 3rd version of the new standard. And then all the way at the end, the red ones are a specific project called Shape, where you had update projects. Now, so what did we do in DSM during all these years? We started all the way back in 1999 with a global template definition for procure-to-pay, order-to-cash, finance, and demand chain planning, meaning we would harmonize the processes first and configure SAP after that. And that, if I look back to this was a mistake. Not completely, but it should have been done slightly different. They should have looked at what processes do we have? What does SAP offer for procure to pay? Can we work with the standard process and harmonize that over the different business groups? That would have been, if I look back at it with hindsight, that would have been the change I would make now. And then we started rolling out this ERP system to 3 different business groups, the first 3. And then based on the feedback, they started working on the second version of what we call then the kernel. That was the global template. And we included plant maintenance in the second wave. And while we were doing that, I already started with the audits on the first 3 projects to see if they actually stick to the standards that we've rolled out to them. Because you can imagine that this was a large project group. That was the same group of people that did the second version and the addition of plant maintenance. But these rollout projects were different groups of external consultants together with business group people. And then I had a group of about between 10 and 20 people that we would visit those projects. We would actually, on a very detailed level, compare the global system with the business group system, because every business group got their own SAP system. And for each deviation that we would find, we would ask to see if they had an approved change request for that. And if not, they needed to turn it back into the standard. I was not a really popular person in most of the project at that time, but I didn't care too much about that. So that's what we started doing. And then, of course, we started rolling out version number 2 to business groups 4, 5, and 6. And then, of course, we did an audit on that as well. And in 2003, based on the previous rollouts, we started working on kernel number 3, which is the one that they still have to today. So that was the ultimate, let's say, final global template that they started rolling out. And that was rolled out to the corporate and service units, CSU, that we also included in project audit. And without that audit, they could not go live. So the interesting thing was that at the moment that I came in with the audit and I delivered the final report to the CIO and to the project director, if my stoplights were not all green, they would not go live. They needed to repair it first and then go live a little bit later. And the reason for that is that after the go live, it was the corporate ICT department that needed to maintain that SAP system. So they needed to make sure that they understood exactly what was changed, why it was changed, and if the documentation was up to par. Now, then what happened after that is, of course, a Delta project, because business group 1 to 6 were still on version number 1 or version number 2. So they needed to all be brought into version number 3. So you can already see that was quite a complexity that we needed to manage in all those years. Actually, I think there was 150 people working on these projects if you add them all up. And then there's a time slot between 2004 and 2012 where it was more of a focus on execution. So go ahead and execute those processes. And then there was a massive risk and compliance project adding risk and controls into the business processes. That took about 3-4 years. That project was called True Blue, but forget about that. It was all about what kind of risk and controls do we have and how do they actually link to our business processes. And then around 2012, there was a revitalization of BPM. The new BPM platform was chosen that we had. And the first thing that we started doing was, let's discover what the business groups are doing and then decide whether or not we need to harmonize, standardize, or allow local variants. So what we've started doing is we started taking all of the business groups through an update project. And you can see business group 3 was divested in the meantime, so that was no longer there. Business group 6 was divested, and then later on a new business group was added. And we would introduce process mining specifically for the discovery part and say, listen, we simply will look at your SAP system. What transactions have you been using, when, how does that process look like, and how does it compare to the standard processes that we still had in the global template? And we used the time afterwards to anchor those results into the BPM COE on a corporate level. So we reported into the C-1 level, so that's 1 level below the managing board. And from there on, it was a continuous discussion and a continuous practice that with every management of change process that we run, we would look back into the central repository, do an impact analysis, and change either the process or the system or both based on that. Now, how does that single repository part run into all of these projects? So let's look at this timeline from a different perspective. So we had a single source of truth in the form of ARIS as a BPM platform. In the process, in the project, but also in the running business, we had process governance set up in the same way in ARIS. And then the development of kernel number 1, so the first global template started back in 1999. And the documentation of the processes and the training documentation all happened in that single source of truth. And then the rollout of that first wave, so those first 3 business groups that you saw, was basically a copy from the single source of truth made available via the ERP, via SAP, into a single source. And then we did in parallel, we did the second kernel development. Of course, you need to have process governance because you're going to make changes to the things that were done in kernel version 1. So that governance became much more important to make sure that you stay on top of all of the changes that are requested to your initial content. And of course, we also did the audits that based on the audits, we sometimes might decide that, well, wait a minute, but what this project did is actually very clever. And we might want to promote that into a standard. And that sometimes happened as well. So it was not just saying you did that wrong and that wrong. Sometimes we also took some best practices from those audits and brought them back into your repository. And then, of course, there was a rollout wave number 2, in which you would roll out kernel 1 and 2. There would be a second wave of audits. There would be a development of that kernel 3. And then in the end, when we had that shape update project, we also added process mining into the mix and used it to find the actual execution and compare that to the improvements and updates. So you can imagine that if you look at the entire picture of this, we had quite a lot of people being active in this. In the end, our BPM Center of Excellence consisted out of about 40 to 45 people, of which about 4 people dealt with the ARIS system, and the others were business consultants helping the business groups in optimizing and managing their business processes. Now, having said that, I think we're quite nice on time. The first question I have is if the question of the person that asked about the what do you change between the process classification, if that has been answered.
Aci, is your question answered, Aci?
Ya, Bu. Tadi sudah terjelaskan dengan baik, so we can take a decision based on that.
Yeah.
Common sense, the
balance. Yeah. I know common sense doesn't sound very academic, but it's still used in the business quite a lot.
Yeah.
All right.
It hits me right. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Are you completed all the slides, Caspar?
Yeah,
Can we take more questions?
Yeah. Oh no, I'm not. Sorry, But I have one more slide, but I want to do it after the Q&A because that's the last thing I would like to share with you.
All right. Okay.
Any questions?
Please. Yes. Bariki would like to ask, please.
Yes, Bu Mahe. Thank you for the question. So I want to ask Mr. Caspar. So currently SAP have a program called S4HANA Movement Program, which help answering customers' question on each step to start their journey to SAP S4HANA by providing tool service and also methodologies. By far, I see that this program helps a lot, both on provide simulation to the client and also building the case for change, and also define deployment plan. Does this program are commonly used by consultant company to introducing S4HANA to their customer? Because if I see on current condition on Indonesia, that on some big company, their staff know that implementing ERP will help the company, but their top management are still don't want to take risk to implementing ERP for their company.
Yeah. That's a good question. Thank you. So yes, SAP has a lot of tools that helps their customers to decide whether or not they need to implement SAP, and if they do implement SAP, what kind of activities would all be needed. And you also see, and let's be transparent in that, is that SAP acquired Signavio not too long ago in a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. And Signavio is basically a competitor of what ARIS does. It's a BPM platform. So SAP acquired it to be better able to do that business process management part that I tried to explain to you within the SAP boundaries. Now, the biggest, and that works. Let's be very clear about that. It works. Signavio is a pretty good product. SAP is a pretty good product. No problems there. However, there is a but. Whatever SAP does is typically focused on SAP alone. And as you might know or might not know, but if you look at large organizations, SAP is just one of the applications. It's an important one, but it's not the only one. So that means that if you engage in BPM, you need to broaden your scope to anything outside SAP as well. And what SAP typically does is they look at SAP alone. They don't care about the other programs that you run and that you use to execute your business processes. So you need to really be conscious about the fact that if you use BPM to engage and to help your ERP implementation, is that you also use BPM much broader. It goes to the entire organization if you do it right. So I hope that answers a little bit your question.
In the
Yes,
interest of
thank you, Mr.
time, I
Kaspar.
think, thank you, Bariki. Ikhlas, would you like to ask your question directly?
Yes, thank you, Bu Mahe. First of all, thank you, Mr. Jans, for a really good insight and lectures today. My questions kind of regarding the situation in Indonesia, where I see there's not a lot of businesses here and enterprises here that apply a more process-oriented practices. Like it's not as popular here in Indonesia as maybe in the Netherlands. A lot of the companies here I see still run, focus on their own department and not necessarily see the big process of their own businesses. At the same time, these companies and enterprises also want to implement a certain degree of ERP system. My question is, should these companies, which currently are not at all process-oriented, prioritize re-engineering their processes first with the BPM approach before even considering implementing ERP? Or is it still okay to do both the BPM and implementing ERP hand-to-hand at the same time?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So you got a lot of good questions today, I have to say. I like that. Yeah, so if you're not using a process-minded approach in your business right now and you are considering implementing ERP, you need to get that process management view very quickly because it's a precondition for ERP. ERP is completely process-oriented. It helps you in executing business processes, and they're all connected. So if you have a bit of a decent above average consultant that's helping an organization in Indonesia in this case to implement ERP, the first thing that they would need to safeguard and assure is, listen, dear management, you want to go into an ERP implementation, but you're completely functionally oriented. And that combination is not going to work. So yes, you can do that at the same time. And I would even argue that it might be efficient to do it at the same time. On the other hand, it might also be good to first have that initial process management view implemented first, and then go into ERP.
All right. Thank you very much. It's really interesting. I would like to invite more questions, but I'm just worried about the time. I think
we're running out of time.
Yes. So if you would like to take us to your final
Yes.
slide, please. Yes.
My final slide, let's make it easy for you. So what do I hope that you picked up today? Because I know I've been talking for about 2 hours almost, and I talk fast typically, so there's a lot of information, but good news is that you recorded the session, so that's good. So there are 3 main points that I think that you should take away from this today. And the first one is that ERP implementations are simply incredibly complex. And it's primarily due to the high variability in all kinds of dimensions, but it's not rocket science. It simply is a lot of work. So that's one. So even as complex as it is, you can very simply break it down into smaller pieces and implement them. So it's not complex. It's not scientifically complex, I would say. The second one is that BPM supports ERP projects by providing that single source of truth during, but more importantly, also after the project. And that includes the governance and the process mining and the transparency that you have. But that is key to a good implementation for ERP, is to have that single source of truth. And finally, and that's around the process mining part, it gives you that quick and detailed glance into the current state of working, which is a baseline for your ERP configuration if you want. So this comes back to that process classification, which part is leading, and what is my baseline information that I have on which I can build, take a decision whether or not I'm going to stick with a standard process or allow for a unique business solution. And what does that mean for my ERP configuration? Am I staying with the standard out of the box ERP and make my life easier in the future for maintenance and change purposes? Or do I need to do configuration or even customization, knowing that in the end, I might have additional efforts, additional costs in analyzing that customization every time that I do an upgrade to the system or every time that I implement a major change into it. Those are the three things that I think are important to take away. Of course, besides the whole slide deck that I'm sure will be shared with you afterwards. And that's pretty much what I had to say. And I'd like to stress to thank all of you and the faculty for having me today. And I had a lot of fun in sharing whatever it is that I think I know by now.
It's really perfect. I think I will need to rewatch it again since I've been trying to moderate and also listening. So I will certainly listen to it again. And it's a really, really nice takeout. And I would love to have you more. But I think this is about time that we have for you today. And thank you again for all this, all the sharing. I'm sure that the students by now should be more motivated, that it's not rocket science, guys and girls. You just need to work harder on it. And thank you for everybody else. At some point in time, we have 200 and something more here, and also 60 more via YouTube. And so thank you very much, Caspar. And I would now return to Bu Ika, please.
Okay, thank you very much for moderating the lecture session, Mahendra, and bunch of thanks to Caspar for the insightful presentation. The lecture you have delivered is exactly what we need to learn about BPM implementation. And so please, everyone, give an applause to Caspar by giving your reaction.
Okay.
And Caspar, please accept our appreciation for all the ideas that you have shared to us. So I will share something to you.
We have something for you. Wait, it's not
something for
much,
you.
But since this is electronic style.
Yep. Wait a moment.
Thank you very much. I wish I can deliver it directly to you. Maybe some other time.
Yeah,
you already got invitation next year. Hopefully.
Thank you.
The COVID situation would be much better. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
okay.
My pleasure. And just last comment from my side. Please feel free to look me up on LinkedIn and send me a connection. I like to connect to all of you. And if you have any questions, then you have a direct connection. So that goes to everybody in the meeting. Don't be shy. I don't bite. You can always ask me a question. I'll try to answer all of them.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So before we end our session today, maybe we can document our attendance for today. So there are 7 pages here. So maybe we can take one by one. So for the slide 1, please give your best look for the documentation. I will count 3, 2, 1, and then we can go directly to the next page. So 3, 2, 1 for slide 1.
Cheers.
Okay. And then go to next slide. Three, 2, 1. Next slide. 3, 2, 1. Thank you. Slide 4. 3, 2, 1.
All right. There are so many pages.
Yeah.
The 6th one and the last one. Thank you very much for everyone.
And
okay.
Pak Muja, would you like to say something before we end, or that's it? No, I don't think so. Pak Muklason as well. If not, then I think I thank you everybody for coming and joining. And for ITS student, please also get more motivated. You still have 4 weeks to go of SAP. And
good luck to all of you.
Yes, thank you, Caspar. And then for the others that joining from Taiwan here, there's Esas, and also we've got several students from Semarang, Udinus, and I also know several other universities. Thank you for joining in. So,
yeah, okay.
All right.
So this is the end of the session. Thank you for all the participation. Don't forget to register your presence today by filling in the form that I have shared to the chat room. Thank you again for all the participation, all the audiences. See you for the next GUELIS session. Bye-bye. Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Can I
Have a nice
just
day.
Pleasure.
have a
Thank
little
you.
chat with you after this?
You again.
Yeah. Sorry, was that to me, Mahendra, or
Yes.
with?
Yes,
Okay.
for you.
Yeah, sure.
Because
Yeah, we can.
we have something unfinished.
Yeah.